We're going to kick things off this morning. One of the fantastic things about this industry is it's disruptive. It's always moving to the cutting edge, or ahead of the curve. It's in some ways the Uber of health. And so today we're going to explore some of those areas. Natalie Dakers is here from Accel-Rx. I'll let her introduce her panel, but going to look into changing healthcare through the use of digital technology and some of the transformation that's occurring there. So Natalie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all. We have our Mounties guarding us for the first while, so no bad behavior in the second half, please. So the reason we were very interested, Accel-Rx was interested in gathering you together with this group of esteemed guests, is there's a whole world out there. We talk a lot about digital health, and there's many aspects to this, but what we wanted to talk about specifically today was what is going on around digital therapeutics. What does that mean? How's that impacting how we're thinking about health? And given what's going on rest of world, we thought it'd be really interesting to hold this discussion here so that we could learn together about how this might impact us in Canada. Because there's lots to learn, and there's really exciting stuff on the edge. And when you think about all the amazing things we're doing in Canada as it relates to AI, and many things related to digital health, maybe we're not touching enough upon the therapeutic side of the conversation. So that's what we're going to try and do today, is learn from our panelists as to what is going on and how this might apply to what we're doing in Canada. So I'm going to I'm just going to introduce them quickly, but I'm going to ask them to speak directly about their backgrounds, because I think it's really important to understand where they came from and how they got into this world of digital therapeutics. So just to my left, I have Megan Coder. She's the Executive Director of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. Next to her, I have Antun Nabhan. He's the VP of Corporate Development in Pear Therapeutics. And then I have Rachel Shaw, who's Digital Business Development and Licensing at Sanofi. So I'm going to ask them each to just take a moment in time and just tell us a little bit about themselves and how they got into this world.
Well, thank you. So my name is Megan. I'm a pharmacist by training, and I've worked in healthcare policy for about 8 or so years in DC, 2 at a tech startup, and then I worked with a core group of companies 2 years ago to start the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. I can go into that more in a moment. Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'm Antun Nabhan. I joined Pear about 2 years ago. I've headed up either finance or corporate development at several biotech and medical device companies, including Raptor and Establishment Labs. Prior to getting into the larger biotechs, at least relative to my early background, I had started a bioinformatics company in 1999. And then prior to that, I was with Deloitte doing systems implementation. So I have kind of an old coder's background and system architect background, but then have spent a couple of decades doing pharmaceutical financing and deals. So kind of bringing those two threads together is what brought me to Pear.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Shaw. As Natalie mentioned, I head up digital business development at Sanofi. And I've been there for the last 14 years, but the last 5 have been focused in digital specifically. We got into this space because initially we realized that for diabetes in particular, we needed to think about additional technologies and connected devices to help patients better manage diabetes and hopefully improve the HbA1c levels. I personally got into this space because I actually started my career at Accenture advising electronics and high-tech clients many, many years ago, and have come full circle back to now be at sort of this convergence space between digital as well as life sciences.
So let's start to give everybody sort of the same starting point here is, how do we define digital therapeutics? And I'm going to ask Megan to provide this for us, and maybe in that you can weave in what the Digital Alliance is and why it got started and why you felt it needed to get started.
Indeed. So digital therapeutics, when we're looking at that class of category, it's really a new category of medicine. So we're looking at software-driven technologies that are delivering a direct intervention, a clinical grade intervention to a patient. And that intervention has to make the claim to prevent, manage, or treat a medical disease or disorder. So they're set apart from the health and wellness apps. They're set apart from adherence, diagnostic, telehealth, and all those other types of categories. They are able to interact with all of those. But it's really crucial to understand that if you have a medical intervention that's being delivered by software, they're making medical claims, you need to be able to back that up with clinical evaluation and regulatory rigor behind that too. So what we're really looking at is, if you're calling yourself a digital therapeutic, what are the core principles you have to adhere to? What really is that definition, and so forth. So that is why the Alliance came together, is to start to help others in the space understand, how do I actually recognize these? How do I actually evaluate these? And then how do I implement them? So DTA, my main focus is providing patients, clinicians, payers, and regulatory agencies with the tools and frameworks they need to actually do those things that I mentioned.
And maybe Antoon, to put that into further context, what is Pear Therapeutics? What's the product that you're actually developing? And did you know right at the beginning when the company was being started that this was actually going to be a regulated therapeutic? Was that the intention right at the beginning?
So at Pear, we focus on prescription digital therapeutics, and I would say our focus is a bit narrower than what Megan just articulated, because we're always looking to work with patients that have a diagnosed disease, and then we're looking to actually treat the disease. So we want to improve whatever is the clinically relevant, the gold standard endpoint that physicians in the space would naturally manage that patient to. And I would contrast that with things like prevention or long-term disease management. We're really trying to create an intervention that treats the disease once it's diagnosed. In terms of the genesis of Pear, I really have to give a lot of credit to our founder and CEO, Corey McCann. His insight was that you needed to have clinical validation, the need to promote to physicians on the basis of your clinical validation leads you into a regulated world. You know, the FDA says the difference between food ingredients or nutraceuticals and drugs is whether you're making an efficacy claim. So if you're making an efficacy claim for a software product, similarly, you would need the FDA label, and that drops us into this regulated pathway. And I think 2 to 3 years ago, there was a high level of skepticism out there in biotech and in the world as to whether the FDA would even look at these products in that way. With the marketing authorization of our first 2 products, Reset and Reset O, I think we've shown that there is now a pathway for therapeutics that includes efficacy-directed label claims. And now we're working on about a dozen additional products of different therapeutic modalities, all within the digital space, across insomnia, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, multiple sclerosis, and now we're getting into cardiovascular diseases like chronic heart failure and atrial fibrillation. So watch this space. I think you'll see a lot of news coming out of Pear in the upcoming 18 to 24 months and probably beyond that as well.
And Rachel, for you, if you think about Sanofi and the traditional way in which they've been developing drugs, how did they get into that? What was the impetus that made them think that this was a reality and they really need to start thinking about how this might get integrated into their own company?
Yeah, so our familiarity with the space really started, as I mentioned, in diabetes. And what we noticed was that a number of the companies are actually able to achieve improvements in HbA1c levels that are just as effective as, say, medicines available today. And so it's clear that through behavior change, through education, through engagement, and making the right choices, that you can actually take steps to improve how you manage your disease. And so that gave us certainly an exposure and an awareness that this is a viable way of achieving improved disease outcomes. From that point in time, we've actually been scanning the therapeutic landscape, and we've seen evidence certainly in other diseases like in respiratory and cardiovascular, where again, a digital therapeutic approach makes sense. And our interests span that spectrum that Megan indicated, where it could be diagnostic, treatment oriented or monitoring oriented. And we're also interested in on a standalone basis, but also as we think about in combination with our drug, is there even greater synergy, greater effects, improvements that we can achieve?
So imagine, I know this question comes up for me when I think about it, is like, okay, so how different is this when you're developing a drug that's from a software versus our traditional path? So what does a clinical trial look like? What do you have to think about? How do you set that up? And there may be, a couple of perspectives to share here.
Given that we are actually looking at those interventions that are making clinical claims, within DTA, we've said that all digital therapeutics must do a full randomized controlled trial, very similar to the way that drugs do. So we're looking at evidence-based medicine here, which is a different mindset to some degree when you're talking about software, because it's just software. We'll just create it, build it, and then they'll come. That's not the case in this industry. So we're looking at having to do pre-market evaluations, RCT as an example, and then really strong post-market evaluations, looking at your real-world performance data, your real-world outcomes, making sure that that quality is being consistently delivered from the pre-market to post-market and onward. And you can probably talk a lot more about how you actually went about the RCT process, but it is something that we are really focused on ensuring that patients and clinicians know that there's that level of quality and standard, and I think payers want to see that too. So anyways.
I would second everything Rachel just said. That's spot on. In terms of the nuts and bolts of how we do it, we start with clinical relevance in whatever therapeutic area we're seeking to approach. So that's talking to physicians, talking to patients, and understanding what's the gold standard metric that physicians are managing their patients to. And obviously in diabetes, it's HbA1c. In the case of our Reset and Reset-O products, which are for substance use disorder and opioid use disorder, that's can the patient stay abstinent from illicit drug use. In the case of things like schizophrenia, it's the PANSS scale, the positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And then we work backward from there and say, okay, how do you need to design that trial to really provide compelling evidence to that physician community and that patient community that you're generating a statistically significant and clinically significant impact on that disease metric? So, it follows from there that your statistical powering is going to drive your clinical trial size. Your clinical trial size and design is going to drive the number of trial sites you need to recruit from. And then we're always looking very carefully at, to what degree can you create a double-blinded situation? Can you realistically use placebo digital content, give patients in the control arm some type of app to use that preserve some measure of blinding as to whether they're on the treatment arm or the control arm? And we kind of work backward through all those questions to create a clinical trial that will give us the most medically compelling results that we can generate.
So Antun, I'm hearing a lot of words that are very familiar to me when I'm thinking about designing a clinical trial, but there's a sense out there that if you follow a digital therapeutic, you're going to be able to have faster timelines, less money raised, less complication, but there's a lot of words that sort of equate to me as dollars spent. So what does that financing look like? And I don't mean strictly on a strategy. I mean, is it true that it's going to be quicker, faster, cheaper? Or is it actually going to end up being just as involved?
So we have a couple of advantages in the digital realm when you think about what's driving clinical trial costs. So a lot of the clinical trial costs in a drug trial is lab tests, and it's hospital visits or physician visits, the medical costs that go along with that, as well as the stipend costs that go along with that. In the digital realm, we're not causing toxicities, right? So a lot of the things that you need to monitor for in the context of a drug clinical trial are not necessary to monitor for. You're not doing liver function tests. You're not worried about the patient's kidneys. You're not really having to monitor for many of these things that drive up the costs. And you also don't have to bring the patient back for quite so many visits, because in most cases you're looking at an endpoint that you measure at the end of the course of digital therapy. And in many cases, you're able to actually monitor via the application itself. So if you're trying to measure the patient's mood, you're trying to measure the patient's level of energy, anhedonia, things like that, you can actually collect those outcomes. They're just questionnaires. You can implement the questionnaires digitally as part of the application package, and you're collecting the data as you go. And then as you close out your clinical trial, that has huge advantages, because all of the database work that we pay biostatisticians to do and write SAS scripts and do all this post-processing that leads into your clinical study report, all that's already in a database because we've been collecting it digitally as we go along. So many aspects that drive clinical trial costs upward are kind of taken out of the equation when you run these studies in the digital realm. And we do, in fact, see, costs are running about 1/3 of the cost per patient that we would typically see relative to drug trials in the same therapeutic area. So big cost savings.
Okay.
Just to build on that, in terms of the product development process and timelines that you asked about, one of the differences between a therapeutic is that we don't have the upfront drug discovery research in terms of the chemistry, all of that, right? In terms of engineering, data science, when you get to a lead candidate, so to speak, that might be weeks, it might be months, and then when you start testing on the product concept, you're able to get to that and refine that on a much shorter time frame, so that when you have a digital therapeutic ready to go into a clinical trial setting, it might only have been 2 years or 18 months or so, or maybe a more, plus minus, but it's a much shorter upfront period before you get to the clinic. So that's also part of the reason why the time to market's much faster. And it's also cheaper because you're using different resources that's not as capitally intensive.
Right.
That's a really good point. And I guess what strikes me as you're talking, I'm thinking, okay, so what does a digital therapeutics company look like? What does that team look like? Like, we're used to CMOs and CTOs and various different individuals that make up key components of a company, but what does a digital therapeutics company look like? How do I hire a software engineer next to a PhD in a particular disease indication? And so first, I'm interested to know, what does that makeup look like? And then if you think about the challenges we have from a culture point of view of even clinicians and biologists and finance, what about you add a bunch of software engineers into the mix? So I'd be really interested to hear, how do you really build that company, and how do you make that culture work? So, because you're bringing in so many different kinds of mindsets. So I'd be really interested in that perspective through the group.
At a high level, it's been fascinating to start to watch all these companies come together. Every single company has their own personality, which is only to be expected. But there's a passion in this industry that I love right now. We're all realizing that we're doing something new. It's innovative, it's different, it's exciting. There's something that you could be delivering to a patient that could forever change the way that healthcare is delivered. That's awesome. So people are tending to work together across the industry and even within their own companies incredibly well from my perspective. Having been in a lot of other industries prior to this, it's been really encouraging that way. So I've seen collaboration, but you could probably speak to more of the day-to-day perspectives of it.
Yeah, so we're constructed like a software company plus a pharmaceutical development company. So we have MD, PhD folks that do clinical sciences, clinical trial design in a way that would look very familiar to anybody out there that's worked in a pharmaceutical development company. We have regulatory folks that come from either the drug or the device world, and we have a change management process, a quality management system, GMP certification that looks right on similar to what you would see in a medical device company, and we're a licensed medical device manufacturer. But we have to develop software products. So we have great folks that are product managers, product designers, user experience designers, and product engineers that actually create the software application. And I think one of the key cultural challenges is that folks coming from that type of a background tend to expect two things. One is they expect rapid iteration and that they can kind of change anything they want to make it as much better as they can, as rapidly as they can. And in a regulated environment, you have to do this in a careful, stepwise fashion that's in accordance with change management processes and standard operating procedures. And so that can feel slower, it can feel more bureaucratic to people that are just coming from, the move fast, break things world of a tech startup mindset. And then the other thing that we find we have to kind of work around and work on is the understanding the biology is nonlinear and confusing. And so the notion that you make a change to the software and it's obvious what change it produces in the patient, or it's obvious how much more efficacy you get, which computer science people, they like things to work in a very mechanistic way. They like their cause and effect relationships to be mathematical and linear. And as we all know, in the biological realm, that's not how that works. And so bringing that more empirical approach from drug development and say, look, we don't know what's going to work until we've tested it. In God we trust, but all others have to bring data. And you can't think your way to the solution a lot of times. You simply have to run a study, and until you've done it, we don't know whether we've got something that works. And importing that mindset into your software development team, that's a cultural shift. And one of the things that I love about Pear is we have now some of the most experienced people in the industry on the software engineering side, on the product development and design side, that have grokked and wrapped their heads around these nonlinear biological relationships, this need for data, and this need to develop software in a way that looks careful and methodical and documented in the way that medical device development looks. And that, I think, is a really powerful dynamic once you've got everybody on the same page with respect to those things.
Yeah, I think what I've seen most interesting and what works the best in this space is when you have sort of a clear, shared, common vision and approach between the scientists, the engineers, the data scientists. So long as that's clear and everyone has that same objective, it's actually great to see the best of the tech culture as well as life sciences culture come together to try to work through these problems, because it won't be a purely a tech approach or a purely life sciences approach that will solve it, because we are looking at a hybrid space. So the ones that we've seen at least who are most successful are the ones who are able to integrate both this very thoughtful kind of scientific data-based approach versus try and fail and iterate kind of approach.
I'd add one
Quick thing about recruiting for tech folks. The people that have made a lot of money, the companies that have made a lot of money on the tech side, the Facebooks, the Googles, the technical people get rewarded for these slight improvements in cost per click, how to sell advertising, how to make people scroll through their feed, for a few more minutes each day. We find that it's a really powerful message in recruiting to say, look, we're a mission-driven organization. Yes, we're commercial, but we're here to help patients. And I would say almost everybody that works for Pear has a family member, a friend, somebody that they're fighting for in a way. All of us at this point have been touched by drug addiction, opioid use disorder. Everybody, I think, probably knows somebody that has mental health challenges, whether that's something like a schizophrenia or anxiety and depression, which I think pretty much everybody in America has nowadays. So being able to work with tech people and say, you're going to solve problems that have a huge, life-changing, positive impact on the patients that we serve, that really motivates people, that really draws people into our space and our company.
There's really been a growth of people actually leaving the tech side because of this mission-driven approach. I mean, we've seen that even coming to our company, where they see, I could spend all my time, all my days and evenings working to increase ad clicks, or I could spend my time trying to address a real medical problem that my relative or my friend have. And the number of people who have come to Sanofi or to startups that we're working with, so many of people have said, I've got burnt out in Silicon Valley. And I really want to apply my talent towards a problem that I care about and that will affect the people that I care about.
Yeah, this is a really interesting thought, because if I take this to my home province in British Columbia, recently there's through a federal initiative that we created superclusters across the country, and one of the ones that was won in that competition was a BC digital supercluster, and it's a big piece of what gaming we're known for. So there's a massive amount of individuals working in the tech industry. We have Microsoft, Google, Amazon. They're recruiting tons of talent into these particular companies. But it's a really interesting thought that you bring out that, we might have a massive pool of talent that we could start to actually poach from.
Build on that. If you're looking at a group like Accel Interactive, they're using a video game style mechanism to actually help treat aspects of ADHD for kids. Their development team partially comes from George Lucas Studios. So they have a lot of these Star Wars guys who are fascinated by this. They know their stuff, and when you're in their studio, you have like these hands coming out of everywhere, and it's just like really cool, creative environment, because that's what they grew up with, or developed through most of their careers, and now they've pivoted into let's help this particular population and really engage them and deliver something meaningful. So I've loved that pivot that they did for that purpose, and I've really seen that consistent across this. It's just been really encouraging to see that motivation.
We have our minister sitting in the audience here, and I'm thinking this is something we got to talk about, because we really do have a massive pool of talent that could be really integrated into what we're trying to do from a health perspective. So thank you for that, because that's a really important tip. So business models, how different are they? What are these companies being built to do? Is it all about partnerships again? Is it about IPO? Is it about exits? What's the future for these kinds of companies? What does this look like?
So I'll jump in on this one. So our business model is to look very drug-like. So we charge for a prescription, just as you would charge for a drug prescription. Other companies, I don't know if I should.
Yeah, I don't know how long the announcement is.
Can folks hear over the announcement? Okay. So other companies in the space are attempting to sell package deals, essentially subscriptions, to large self-insured employer groups and to payer groups that would then make the digital intervention available to patients that are part of that health insurance plan. And I think the jury is out as to whether that business model will be successful. I would observe, I think our observation as a company is that companies that have pursued that sell through to insurance type of model have not had a lot of uptake and a lot of usage. And even the companies that have had relatively solid uptake, like an Ovia Health, they're not getting a lot of remuneration per patient, and really probably aren't able to build a profitable business even on a unit economic basis, just the cost of serving a single patient relative to the cost of relative to the revenue that you can achieve from a single patient. So, our observation, and I think we'll have a lot more data 2 or 3 quarters into our launch. We're really 1.5 quarters into our commercial launch, is that the prescription route is going to be more conventional, more legible way to go. It ties the revenue specifically to the benefit of the patient that's receiving that benefit, and we think that that's the way to get physicians' attention and drive usage, engagement, and uptake. So that's our view. We'll see 1 to 2 years from now, I think, how these business models evolve.
Honestly, I think a lot of time and energy is focused on the technology innovation, but the business model innovation is almost just as important in this space. And we have seen companies succeed and fail because of the business model as opposed to the technology. A number of years ago, we had partnered with Verily Life Sciences and formed this joint venture called Onduo. in part to put together the right set of solutions to empower patients with type 2 diabetes, but in part also to figure out what was the right business model to offer these. We've seen groups target self-insured employers, others payers, providers, direct to consumers, and we've seen varying degrees of success, and also that many of the companies may start in one business model and then pivot in terms of how they go to market. So I think we're still in, frankly, early days to figure out who's willing to pay and how long are they willing to pay for, and what kind of outcomes are they expecting.
So one of the things that happened in the States recently is Express Scripts, one of the large PBMs here, announced the launch of their first ever digital health formulary. So this is something that we've been talking about for a long time, but I think once you start to see more digital health products, whether they're therapeutics or otherwise, get added to formularies, you're going to start to see other business models start to be created. We are very early in this industry. There are a number of players who have been in this for quite a long time. But as these things start to happen, that I think could actually drive significant change in the industry and open up areas we didn't know about. The other aspect of this is we're looking at possibly physicians prescribing, we're looking at pharmacists dispensing, we're looking at diabetes educators managing these products. So the partnership perspective is really important too, in terms of you need this to be integrated into the health system. So you need to work with all those players too.
Right.
Because if you get it paid for, great, but you need someone to actually manage that, prescribe it, run it, make sure that the patient's getting the treatment that they need across that whole spectrum.
Well, I was at one of the workshops that Bio's putting on digital health. There's been a whole stream of different panels, and one of the questions that got raised is, when you don't understand how to use a prescription medicine, you phone your pharmacist up and you ask them how to administer, or whatever your question might be around your dosage. But with a software, who do you phone? Who's helping you? Because you can imagine all of us, especially later generation, we're like banging on the wrong keys of our computer trying to figure out what to do. Who's our help desk?
Right.
Who's the guy that we're going to call to really help us understand how to use whatever it is that's being provided through this software?
At Pear, we actually stood up a help desk. So we have a call center. There are human beings that pick up the phone. There's a 1-800 number that patients can call, the physicians can call. And we're actually quite proactive about reaching out to patients when they first get a prescription, ensure that they can get up and running. If we see patients do the first couple of modules of a therapeutic and then drop off, we will actually have somebody reach out to them via phone and email. So it's not, and some of this is automatable, so we can scale actually relatively efficiently, but there is a human element and there is a business process that we have found you really need to stand up in order to successfully scale these businesses and really get patients a level of comfort with the therapeutic in the same way that pharmacovigilance organizations inside of pharma and pharmacies have been doing for years on the drug side.
Yeah, very similar to the specialty pharmacy hub model is what I've seen.
Yep.
There's definitely a range of service and support models. I think certainly there's no replacement for interacting with a human being and getting that personalized support and answering your questions. But to scale some of these opportunities, we've definitely seen other companies look at chatbots, avatars, and other ways to engage, to answer low acuity, easy to answer questions in the first levels. And also, patients in this instance can access that support anytime they need it. It's only when you get to sort of the human interactions that it gets logistically a little bit more complicated and certainly more costly. So I think if you offer a range of customer engagement or patient engagement models, that's certainly one difference in this space.
Of us are thinking about, from a payer, when you were talking through the business model, what is the payer in Canada? How are we going to deal with that when you think about our own regulatory process? But let's just touch on that a wee bit from the regulatory. As we started this conversation, digital health, there's all kinds of technology out there. Much of it is not regulated. There's lots of different things that you can do to help your health. But the kinds of things we're talking about today is very much under the regulation. So how does a company, figure out that they need to go down that path? And then if they're going to go down that path, what does that look like? What is it that you're up against when you're thinking about it? And I know there's been considerable change since this all began. But it'll be interesting for us when we think about what does that mean in Canada, because I know right now we're kind of on hold in this area. You know, we're watching as to what's going on rest of world to give us guidance on how we go forward. But what does it look like for you, and what are you up against when you're thinking about that path?
So again, at a high level, the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, the IMDRF, they put out a framework quite a few years back on software as a medical device, and most digital therapeutics fall under that framework. So the FDA has already gone and accepted that. Health Canada is actually looking at that. They had a common proposal open, I think, just a few months ago to actually figure out how do we use CMD in Canada. And then we're looking at a variety of other countries taking on this idea of how do you do a risk-based approach. So it all comes down to that claim that the product is making. So if it's a higher risk approach, then you have different regulations that are applicable. A lower level claim that's less risk, then you have accordingly the similar regulations that apply to that. So the IMDRF is a good document to read. Also of interest is in NHS and NICE, they put out this guidelines. It's called Evidence for Effectiveness. I love reading it because it's the first time I've seen a regulatory agency go on record saying, if you're going to make claims per whichever level of these three tiers are, these are the specific types of clinical evidence you have to achieve, and then also the health economic outcomes you have to achieve for a local commissioner to decide whether or not to implement that product in their area. So there are things happening. We are trying to promote as much as possible a consistency and a cohesion, because a product that is used in the States will likely eventually be used in Canada and the EU and Australia and all these other locations. So we are trying to encourage that idea of really cohesion and consistency in the way that these regulations are developing. But the specifics, you guys have faced this. You're also part of FDA's pre-cert program, so you could probably talk to more of that too, what you've seen.
I think so. The U.S. FDA got out ahead of this. They established the digital pre-certification program. They solicited guidance and dialogue with 9 different companies, of which we're one, to try and understand what does clinical evidence look like, what does good manufacturing practice look like in the software realm, what does a quality management system need to contain. And so they've been, I think, admirably solicitous of information and advice, and they have been proactive about setting up a regulatory framework. And we're now seeing EMA set up a similar regulatory framework. They've also kind of let it be known that the medical device framework that's applicable to non-software devices is applicable to software. And as you alluded to, the NHS in the UK is issuing guidance. IQWIG in Germany has issued a position paper. We've seen the Chinese FDA, which is much more intertwined with reimbursement in China than the US FDA is, obviously, issue a position paper saying, yes, we will give an efficacy-based label to a software product if the sponsor comes with clinical data. And they've also issued a recommendation to the provincial authorities that such products be reimbursed if they come with efficacy data. So I think a number of countries are kind of looking at the US experience. They're bought into the notion that this is a therapeutic modality that can genuinely help patients, and I think can also genuinely reduce healthcare costs overall. Right? We can help patients avoid a lot of negative outcomes, and we can help patients with physiological comorbidities that go along with a variety of different diseases that create lots of long-term costs for healthcare systems. And I think as with a good drug, if you do this right, you actually are avoiding other costs in the system. And a lot of the health authorities of different nations in the developed world, at least, have recognized this already, and they're on a path.
So, intellectual property. This is always something that we think about, obviously, from drug device point of view. we don't really know what kind of intellectual property is relevant as it connects to software. So how does this work in this world? How do we protect our worlds? And is this as important, given the comment that algorithms are changing all the time and maybe it's not looking the same way? Are we looking at IP the same way? Are we going to be as protective about IP the same way? What are we going to do about that? Do you want to start, Rachel?
Sure, I can start. I would say in all the deals that we're negotiating, IP is the one area that is the stickiest. So people might think that in this tech space, IP doesn't matter. It does matter. You have to be thoughtful about the data, the modeling, the algorithms, the experience. All of that is potentially patentable. And we, because of our interest in this space, we are quite careful about when we want to protect that interest and keep it exclusive. But equally, if it's a platform capability, we're willing to consider, non-exclusive and also working to try to ensure it becomes a standard across the industry. So we actually have a pretty broad and flexible approach to intellectual property, but for sure we spend a lot of time and energy discussing it internally and also with the potential partners that we have. So the first thing is be thoughtful about what's most important to you and how you think about using that as a way to either protect your investment, protect your business model, et cetera. Now, all of that said, in this space, oftentimes I hear speed is more important than the patents because in technology, it's a lower bar to kind of innovate around. So the faster you move, the faster you improve upon your product and your solution. That sometimes can be a larger competitive barrier than the patents themselves. But for sure, we spend a lot of time and energy on patents.
Yeah.
Sorry, just a quick question to that. Are we going to be spending as much money on it?
Probably. Yeah. Sorry.
So why is that?
So if you look at the patent volume of tech companies, right? The technology companies that develop software for a living file patents like crazy. So, there is a whole literature, there's a whole framework for how you create patent claims around novel aspects of a software product, how you create patent claims around the method of using that product. In our case, we have a number of patents with claims around drug plus digital combinations, which are patentable compositions. So there's a variety of different ways to claim patentable matter that's all very well established. We're not really treading new ground here. We're doing what software companies have done, for 50, 60 years. So there's a lot of patentable subject matter around the software products. And then, of course, we also have copyright in the software realm, which we don't have in the drug realm. So, you can't just create a copycat song. You can't just create a copycat movie. You can't just create a copycat book. And similarly, competitors that want to create a software product within a therapeutic area, they have to do it with content that is substantially different from what you've already taken to the FDA. And then when you take that new product to the FDA, you have to bring your own data to prove that that different product is producing the same clinical efficacy or similar clinical efficacy to digital products that the FDA has authorized for marketing prior. So there's a couple of different silos here of intellectual property, patent and copyright, and then of course, as you accumulate data on your patients and on their usage patterns, that becomes a very powerful well to draw from for insights about how to iterate the products and create more effective products. And I think that becomes a real head start and a real competitive barrier that the companies starting from scratch will find difficult to replicate as the data lakes that we accumulate become broader and deeper.
The other thing to mention is the Digital Therapeutics Alliance is working with the U.S. Pharmacopoeia to start to create quality standards. And part of that is we're looking at what are the inactive ingredients in the product, what are the active ingredients, and then how can you eventually identify a counterfeit digital therapeutic? How can you identify an adulterated digital therapeutic? So the same ideas that apply in the drug world will likely apply here. So we're trying to start to figure that out now. what does that look like, and how can we actually address this before we get to that world where people are saying, I have Pear's Reset O and it's $3 a pop, and you're like, hey, let's look at what that really is. So we're trying to start to put standards together now so we can eventually take those steps to protect patients and make sure they're getting the right high quality products that they're being promised.
So I think this is one of the reasons why when you think about digital health, that both sides of the equations are so important. In other words, people that really understand fundamentally how you develop something that's going to have an effect on your body relative to those that can think about it from a technology point of view. In other words, it truly is a marriage between the health and technology side. And I think we have to appreciate the roles that are going to be played here, and frankly, the need to have both sides of the equation. So maybe we just have a little bit more time, and I just want to close off with some thoughts about how do you get these companies financed? I mean, we're hearing, what was it last year? $8 billion is being invested in the area of digital health. And there's obviously a large proportion going towards digital therapeutics. So there are investors out there making massive. In fact, I saw slides just the other day where they partitioned a bunch of companies into categories of 50 million raised, 100 million raised, 150 million raised. These companies are raising tons and tons of dough. It's amazing. So the question is, how is this getting done? Who are the investors that are actually investing? And if I was a company wanting to get into this world, who do I start my conversations with? Do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. So it is indeed a really blossoming space. You quoted the $8 billion number, so those are Rock Health report. If you want more information, Rock Health puts out a report, annual report, as does Startup Health. Startup Health has a 14 billion number. They've got an 8. Depends on how you draw the market and the definitions. But the key thing is to highlight it's a large number that includes this seed to Series D and exits. And the other thing is that it's as you compare it to life sciences and biotech. And all of investments in this space, it's actually about 28% in 2018 went to digital health space overall. So this is a very significant and alive space. In terms of the types of investors, we've seen two types of investors, and certainly the ones that we interface with. They are the tech classical investors who are catching on to the life sciences space, and then they're the classical life sciences investors who realize that there's something going on the digital side of things. They both bring very different perspectives and competencies and experience to the space, and also their biases towards what makes a good investment or not, what makes a good team or not. And some of the greatest or the strongest startups that we've interfaced with are ones that are actually able to attract both. Because you need the tech investor to help advise you on product development, to bring in investment on that side, as well as the life sciences investor to help you navigate the clinical regulatory space, as well as potentially think about go-to-market and innovating on the go-to-market space. So we've seen both types of investors, and frankly, new ones that have started up actually solely dedicated in digital health. Just this morning, I was just meeting with a group that was looking to actually raise funds for digital specific opportunities. So there are a number of digital health specific funds that are getting created. The two areas, there's East Coast and West Coast, at least as we think about the US. East Coast, West Coast really dominate investment in this space. But what's interesting is that there are new hotspots popping up in other parts of the US. You know, my group is a global group, so we're also tracking what's going on in Europe, in Asia, and Latin America. And certainly there are growing numbers of investors in these other geographies in the digital health space. So lots of activity.
Who invested in you?
So our Series A was led by 5AM Ventures, which is an early stage biotech focused venture group, as well as Jazz and Arboretum, which are more crossover and tech focused venture groups. Subsequent rounds of Series B was led by Temasek, which is the sovereign wealth fund of Singapore, and has been a very large and long-term investor in biotech companies, and also has made a lot of very large long-term investments in tech companies. And I think that is very much in keeping with the pattern that Rachel talked about. Having venture investors with expertise in both is really helpful. I think if you go to solely tech-focused VCs, typically there is a mismatch of expectations around time horizon to first revenue and time horizon to scale, right? The notion of, wait a minute, you guys are going to be burning money for 3 to 4 years, and you're spending tens of millions of dollars on clinical studies before I even see a dime of revenue. Tech investors who are used to investing in the Ubers and Lyfts and whatever of the world, that's a scary notion for them. And then on the purely biotech side, wrapping their heads around, well, what's the regulatory path, and really how protectable are these products? What's the moat? And how much reimbursement can you really garner per patient? These are the types of questions that we find frequently biotech-focused investors have gotten hung up on. But there's this certainly ample and growing group of investors that understand digital therapeutics. They get this melding of clinical development with software development. And I think, capital raising is not the limiting factor for this portion of the industry by any means. We've got a lot of good, smart investors out there with fresh pools of capital that are looking for the right teams and the right opportunities.
Well, this has been awesome. I hope you guys have been learning as much as I have. I think part of the messaging we're getting here is there's tons going on. There's lots of people to learn from, and there's great opportunity given some of our expertise in Canada. So I think this is something we need to spend more time on, and we are extremely grateful to have Rachel, Antoon, and Megan to help us get educated. And I'm sure they'd be more than willing to meet with you, chat with you, help you with any questions that you might have if this is an area that you'd like to learn more about. So please join me in thanking our panelists for this conversation today.